November 3rd, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Dawn breaks cold and gray over a landscape that has already consumed thousands of American lives in some of the most brutal fighting of the European theater. In a foxhole carved into the muddy earth near the village of Schmidt, Private First Class Raymond Henry Dalton peers through the scope on his Springfield M1903A4 rifle, watching a ridgeline 510 yards distant. 4 German observers are moving with practiced confidence across the elevated ground, believing themselves safely beyond the reach of American riflemen. They have good reason for this confidence. Every tactical manual, every training doctrine, every briefing from battalion headquarters has established 400 yards as a maximum effective range for rifle fire. Beyond that distance, the Army teaches, accuracy becomes too unreliable for practical combat use. The Germans know this. They have studied capture American field manuals. They understand that at 500 yards, they operate in a safe zone, a buffer distance that protects them while they call down artillery fire on American positions below. What they do not know, what no one in the German High Command could possibly anticipate, is that the man watching them through that scope has spent the last 3 weeks testing a theory that contradicts official doctrine. Dalton's rifle bears a modification so subtle that most soldiers would not notice it even if they inspected the weapon closely. A bent finishing nail, carefully shaped and soldered to the rear sight assembly, creating a visual reference point that exists nowhere in any Army manual. This crude addition, this unauthorized alteration fashioned from scrap metal and determination, is about to demonstrate that the Springfield rifle is capable of far more than the doctrine allows. Dalton's finger moves to the trigger. His breathing slows. The first German observer, a sergeant carrying binoculars and a map case, pauses on a ridgeline to survey the American positions. He never completes that survey. The shot echoes across the valley, and the sergeant drops. The 3 remaining observers freeze for a critical half-second, confusion overriding training. They have been hit from a distance they believed was safe. Before they can react, before they can drop to cover or sprint for tree lean, Dalton cycles the bolt and fires again. The second man falls. Now panic sets in. The 2 survivors begin to run, abandoning their elevated observation post, sacrificing the tactical advantage they have held all morning. But they are running across open ground, and Dalton has already calculated the lead necessary for a moving target at this range. Third shot, third kill. The final German observer makes it another 15 yards before the 4th bullet finds him. 4 men, 4 shots, 510 yards. 0 misses. In the foxholes below, American soldiers who have been pinned down by accurate German artillery for the last hour emerge cautiously, staring up at the now empty ridgeline. They do not understand what has just happened. The German observers who have been directing devastating fire onto their positions have suddenly vanished. Within minutes, the German artillery falls silent, the forward observers who guided those shells no longer able to correct their aim. Lieutenant Morrison, the platoon commander, crawls through the mud to Dalton's position, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. He asks the obvious question, "How did you make those shots?" The manual says 400 yards maximum effective range. Those Germans were at least 500 out, maybe more. Dalton, already cleaning his rifle, offers a response that is technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. "Good condition, sir. Clear sight picture. The rifle can do more than the book says if you know how to read the drop." Morrison studies him for a long moment, then glances at the Springfield. He notices nothing unusual. The bent nail addition is small, unobtrusive, blending with the mechanical components of the sight assembly. He does not ask to inspect the weapon more closely. In the brutal calculus of infantry combat, results matter more than methods. The German artillery has stopped. American lives have been saved. Morrison nods and moves on, filing a report that will credit Dalton with 4 confirmed kills at long range, but will not mention any modifications to standard issue equipment. This is not the first time Dalton has used his improvised range marker, but it is the first time the results have been so dramatic, so immediately impactful. For the soldiers who witnessed the shooting, who saw 4 distant threats eliminated in rapid succession, the incident becomes a subject of quiet conversation, passed along in whisper exchanges during watch changes and meal breaks. The sniper with the magic rifle, the guy who can hit what he aims at no matter the range. But these conversations do not reach official channels. They remain part of the unofficial knowledge that circulates among combat troops, the practical wisdom that exists parallel to, and sometimes in contradiction with, formal doctrine. To understand how Raymond Dalton came to modify his rifle in defiance of Army regulations, it is necessary to understand who he was before the war transformed him into a sniper. Born in 1922 in the steel town of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Dalton grew up in a world defined by precision and measurement. His father worked at the Bethlehem steel plant, operating machinery that shaped metal to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. From an early age, Raymond absorbed the culture of the mill, where imprecision meant failure, where every dimension mattered, where the difference between acceptable and defective could be measured with calipers and micrometers. He learned to see the world through the lens of mechanical accuracy, to understand that tools could be improved, that published specifications were often conservative estimates rather than absolute limits. At 14, he began working weekend shift at the plant, cleaning equipment and learning the basics of metalworking. By 16, he was operating a lathe, fabricating replacement parts for aging machinery. The work taught him how metal behaved under stress, how it could be shaped and joined, how improvisation could solve problems that standard procedures could not address. When he turned 18 in 1940, the war in Europe was already raging, though America had not yet entered the conflict. Dalton continued working at the steel mill, contributing to the production of armor plate and structural components for warships. He might have remained there for the duration, granted deferment as an essential industrial worker, but the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed everything. Like millions of other young American men, Dalton felt the pull of obligation. He enlisted in January 1942, leaving the steel mill for basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. The transition from civilian to soldier was difficult for him. He was not a natural fit for the rigid hierarchy and standardized procedures of military life, where the Army demanded conformity. Dalton's instinct was to question and modify, where regulations specified exact methods. He saw opportunities for improvement. His drill sergeants noted his tendency to suggest alternative approaches to assigned tasks, a trait that earned him repeated disciplinary actions for insubordination. Yet those same sergeants also noticed his exceptional performance on the rifle range. Dalton treated marksmanship the way he had treated metalworking, as a technical discipline requiring precision and understanding. He did not simply follow the shooting techniques outlined in training manuals. He experimented with grip, stance, breathing, trigger control, analyzing how small variations affected accuracy. His scores were consistently among the highest in his training company. When the time came for advanced assignment, his combination of rifle skills and troublesome independence made him a logical candidate for sniper training. The Army needed men who could operate autonomously, who could make decisions without constant supervision, who possessed the patience and precision necessary for long-range shooting. In the summer of 1942, Dalton was sent to the newly established sniper school at Camp Perry, Ohio, where he received instruction in fieldcraft, camouflage, range estimation, and advanced marksmanship. The course was rigorous, designed to identify soldiers who possessed both the technical skill and the psychological temperament for sniper work. Many candidates failed, unable to handle the isolation and pressure of operating alone in enemy territory. Dalton thrived. He absorbed the lessons on wind reading and trajectory calculation, studying the ballistics tables that describe how bullets dropped over distance. But even here, in a program designed to push beyond standard infantry training, he noticed limitations. The doctrine emphasized engagement ranges between 200 and 400 yards, treating anything beyond 400 as unreliable. Instructors acknowledged that the Springfield rifle was theoretically capable of accurate fire at longer distances, but they stressed that combat conditions, wind, target movement, and the stress of battle made longer shots impractical. Dalton disagreed, though he was smart enough not to voice his dissent openly. He had learned from his disciplinary troubles in basic training that the Army did not reward soldiers who challenged established procedures. Instead, he filed the information away, knowing the conservative nature of the doctrine, recognizing that official caution might not reflect actual capability. In September 1943, Dalton shipped out to England as part of the build-up for the invasion of Europe. He spent the winter training with the 28th Infantry Division, preparing for the cross-channel assault. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, his unit was held in reserve, not landing in Normandy until late June. The fighting that followed was brutal and grinding, a slow push to the hedgerows of France against determined German resistance. Dalton operated as part of a sniper team, paired with a spotter who helped identify targets and calculate range. Together, they engaged German soldiers at distances between 200 and 400 yards, achieving consistent kills that disrupted enemy operations and demoralized German infantry. But as the campaign progressed into the fall, Dalton began to notice a pattern that troubled him. German forces were adapting their tactics, recognizing the threat posed by American snipers and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Officers and forward observers began operating at greater distances, staying beyond the 400-yard range that American doctrine treated as maximum effective. They had learned through bitter experience that American snipers were deadly within that envelope, so they simply moved outside it. The result was a tactical advantage for the Germans. Their observers could direct artillery fire from positions of relative safety, calling down devastating barrages on American units, while remaining immune to sniper interdiction. Dalton watched friends die from artillery strikes guided by observers he could see but could not engage. The math was cruel and simple. The Germans operated at 500 yards. American doctrine stopped at 400. That 100-yard gap represented a zone of immunity, a buffer that cost American lives daily. He discussed the problem with his spotter, Corporal Eddie Reich, a former surveyor from Colorado, who shared Dalton's interest in precision and measurement. Together they began conducting unofficial experiments during quiet periods, using a surveyor's rangefinder that Reich had acquired through unofficial channels. They identified landmarks at known distances, then practiced estimating range by sight, developing a feel for what 500 yards looked like in different terrain and lighting conditions. When opportunities arose, Dalton took shots at German equipment and positions beyond the 400-yard line, testing the rifle's capability. The results were mixed but promising. At 450 yards, his hit rate remained acceptable, perhaps 60% under good conditions. At 500 yards, accuracy dropped significantly, maybe 30%, but the shots that connected proved that the rifle was mechanically capable of reaching that far with lethal effect. The problem was not the weapon's potential, but rather the difficulty of compensating for bullet drop at extended range. The Springfield's iron sights, even with the scope mounted on the sniper variant, required significant holdover at 500 yards. The bullet dropped approximately 40 inches from the line of sight at that distance, meaning Dalton had to aim well above his intended target, estimating the necessary elevation without any reference point built into the sight system. It was guesswork made slightly more educated by practice, but still guesswork. He needed a way to make the holdover consistent, to create a visual reference that would allow him to repeat successful shots rather than rely on instinct and luck. The solution came to him in early October, during a period when his unit was pulled back from the line for a rest and refit near the Belgian border. Sitting in a barn that served as temporary quarters, cleaning his rifle and thinking about the ballistics problem, he remembered a technique his father had used at the steel mill. When cutting metal on a lathe, machinists sometimes added temporary reference marks to the equipment, small scratches or dots that helped them gauge depth or alignment without constantly checking measuring tools. These marks were not official parts of the machine. They violated the manufacturer's specifications, but they made the work faster and more accurate. Dalton realized he could apply the same principle to his rifle sight. If he could add a reference point at the correct visual position, he could use it to aim consistently at 500 yards without guessing the holdover each time. The reference point would need to be precisely positioned, calculated based on the bullet's trajectory and the sight's geometry. It would need to be durable enough to survive the rough handling of combat, and it would need to be subtle enough that casual inspection would not immediately reveal it as an unauthorized modification. He spent 2 days working through the mathematics, using the ballistics tables from his sniper training manual and drawing diagrams on scraps of paper. The calculations required accounting for the scope's height above the bore, the muzzle velocity of the standard M2 ball ammunition, and the rate of bullet drop over. Distance When he was satisfied with the theory, he began looking for materials. The solution came from an unexpected source. Behind the barn, he found a partially destroyed wooden crate, the kind used to ship ammunition. Several bent finishing nails protruded from the splintered wood. He pulled one free and studied it. The nail was thin, perhaps 1/8 of an inch in diameter, made of steel that would be easy to shape and solder. Perfect, using tools borrowed from a unit's armorer, a sympathetic sergeant who asked no questions about why a sniper needed metalworking equipment. Dalton spent an evening fabricating his modification. He heated the finishing nail over a small camp stove until it glowed red, then bent it into an L shape using a pair of pliers. The vertical portion would attach to the sight assembly, while the horizontal portion would extend into his field of view when he looked through the scope, creating a visual reference point. The critical dimension was the length of that horizontal extension and its position relative to the crosshairs. Too high and it would be useless, providing no help with holdover. Too low and it would obstruct the sight picture, blocking his view of the target. He needed to position it exactly where his point of aim should be when engaging a target at 500 yards. Based on his calculations, that position was approximately 3 inches above the center of the crosshairs, as measured in the scope's field of view. He test-fitted the bent nail multiple times, holding the rifle as if preparing to shoot, closing one eye and looking through the scope to judge the position. When he was satisfied, he used solder and a small torch to attach the nail permanently to the rear sight assembly. The work was delicate, requiring a steady hand and careful heat control to avoid damaging the sight. When the solder cooled, he tested the attachment, shaking the rifle, tapping the sight. The nail held firm. The modification was complete, though untested in actual combat. It looked crude, like exactly what it was, a piece of improvised field engineering created from scrap materials. But Dalton was not concerned with aesthetics. He cared only whether it worked, whether it would allow him to make consistent hits at 500 yards. The next morning, with the cooperation of Corporal Reich, he conducted an unofficial live-fire test. They found a destroyed German half-track at a measured distance of 515 yards, confirmed with the surveyor's rangefinder. Dalton set up in a concealed position and prepared to shoot. Looking through the scope, he could see the bent nail reference point extending into the upper portion of his field of view. He aligned the target with the nail tip rather than the crosshairs, placing the horizontal portion of the bent nail on the center mass of the half-track's visible profile. He took a breath, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the impact, a spark of metal on metal as the bullet struck the half-track's hull less than 6 inches from where he had aimed. Corporal Reich, watching through binoculars, let out a low whistle. "Dead on," he said. "Try it again." Dalton fired 4 more rounds, adjusting slightly between shots to test the consistency. All 5 bullets impacted within an 18-inch group, clustered around the point of aim, for a target at 500 yards, engaged with iron-sighted ammunition designed for shorter ranges. The accuracy was remarkable. The bent nail worked. Reich suggested they report the modification through official channels, arguing that if Dalton's improvised sight could improve long-range effectiveness, the Army should know about it. But Dalton refused. He had seen too many good ideas disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of military administration, swallowed by committees and testing protocols that took months or years to reach conclusions. Men were dying now, killed by artillery directed by observers operating safely beyond 400 yards. He did not have months to wait for official approval. Instead, he decided to prove the concept through results. If the bent nail sight worked in combat, if it allowed him to engage targets that were previously untouchable, the evidence would speak for itself. Other snipers would notice. Word would spread. The modification might eventually be adopted informally, passed along to the network of shooters who shared techniques and innovations outside official channels. And if officers noticed the unauthorized alteration, if someone decided to discipline him for modifying government property, well, that was a problem for later. Right now, Americans were dying because German observers felt safe at 500 yards. Dalton had a tool that could reach them. On October 12, 1944, he got his first opportunity to use the bent nail sight in combat. His unit was engaged in operations near Aachen, Germany, pushing into the Siegfried Line fortifications. A German observation post had been directing mortar fire onto advancing American infantry from a position atop a concrete bunker. The range was estimated at 480 yards, too far for effective rifle fire, according to doctrine. Dalton took the shot anyway, using his improvised reference point. The German observer fell, killed instantly. The mortar fire ceased. No one questioned how Dalton had made the shot. In the chaos of combat, at a range that was close enough to 400 yards to seem plausible, the kill was simply recorded as another successful sniper engagement. But Dalton knew the difference. The bent nail had allowed him to reach a target that would have been impossible with standard sighting methods. Over the following 2 weeks, he used the modification 6 more times, engaging German personnel at ranges between 450 and 520 yards. 5 of the 7 shots resulted in kills. The 2 misses came under difficult conditions, high wind and poor visibility, situations where even a perfect sight picture could not guarantee accuracy. The success rate was not perfect, but it was far better than the near-zero effectiveness that standard doctrine would have predicted at those ranges. By the time November arrived and the 20th Infantry Division entered the nightmare of the Hurtgen Forest, Dalton's reputation among the snipers in his battalion had begun to change. He was no longer just another competent marksman. He was a guy who could make impossible shots, who operated at ranges that others considered futile. The reputation was both earned and exaggerated, built on a foundation of genuine skill, but amplified by the mythology that always surrounds snipers in combat. Soldiers who had never witnessed his shooting attributed kills to him that he had not made, constructing a legend that exceeded the reality. But the core truth remained. Raymond Dalton could hit targets at 500 yards with consistency that defied official expectations. And he could do it because he had modified his rifle in a way that no Army manual authorized. The action on November 3rd, the engagement that opened this account, was neither the first nor the last time Dalton used his bent nail sight. But it was the most dramatic, the most consequential, the clearest demonstration of what the modification could achieve. 4 German observers eliminated in rapid succession artillery fire. Silence, American lives saved. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable, but there was also a longer-term effect, subtler and harder to quantify. Other snipers began asking questions. How do you judge the range? How do you calculate the holdover? Can you teach me to make those shots? Dalton shared his knowledge cautiously, working within the informal network of shooters who understood that battlefield effectiveness sometimes required going beyond official procedures. He showed his bent nail modification to a handful of trusted fellow snipers, explaining the mathematics and the fabrication process. Some of them replicated the modification on their own rifles, adapting the design to their personal shooting styles and preferences. By late November, at least 8 snipers in the 28th Infantry Division were using improvised range markers based on Dalton's original concept. The modifications varied in appearance, some using bent nails like Dalton's, others using small metal tabs or wire loops, but all served the same purpose, providing a visual reference for long-range holdover. The effect on German operations was significant. Forward observers who had previously operated with confidence at 500 yards found themselves under threat, harassed by accurate rifle fire that should not have been possible. German after-action reports from this period, discovered decades later in archives, note with confusion that American snipers appear to be achieving effective ranges well beyond the specifications listed in captured field manuals. Some German officers speculated that the Americans had deployed a new weapon, perhaps a specialized long-range rifle that had not been previously identified. The truth, that American snipers were simply using their existing rifles more effectively through improvised modifications, never occurred to them. The German doctrine, like the American doctrine, assumed that published specifications represented actual limits rather than conservative guidelines. Yet, despite the tactical success and the informal spread of the modification among combat snipers, the bent nail sight never received official recognition or adoption. Army officers who became aware of the unauthorized modifications faced a dilemma. On one hand, the improvised sights were clearly effective, demonstrably improving sniper performance at extended ranges. On the other hand, acknowledging their existence would mean admitting that official doctrine had been unnecessarily conservative, that soldiers have been operating under artificial limitations. It would mean explaining to higher headquarters why equipment modifications were being tolerated in violation of regulations. The easiest solution, the path of least bureaucratic resistance, was to pretend not to notice. Snipers who used bent nail sights were allowed to continue, their kills recorded without comment on the methods used to achieve them. Officers wrote reports that credited improved training and favorable conditions for the increased effectiveness of sniper operations, carefully avoiding any mention of unauthorized equipment modifications. The modifications existed in a gray zone, neither officially approved nor actively suppressed, tolerated because they worked but never formally acknowledged. This institutional blindness persisted even after the war ended. When the Army conducted its post-war analysis of sniper operations in Europe, examining what had worked and what needed improvement, the improvised range markers used by men like Dalton were not mentioned in any official report. The historical record, as preserved in archives and unit histories, contains no reference to the bent nail sights that had enhanced American sniper capability during the final months of the war. Raymond Dalton survived the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest and continued serving with his unit to the end of the war in May 1945. He was never wounded, never captured, never decorated for valor beyond the standard campaign medals awarded to all soldiers who served in Europe. His sniper kills were recorded in unit logs, eventually totaling 43 confirmed over the course of the campaign. But the circumstances of those kills, the ranges involved, the methods used, were not preserved in detail. After the war, he returned to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and resumed his work at the steel mill. He married, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet life that bore no outward sign of what he had done in combat. He did not speak publicly about his wartime service, following the pattern common among many veterans who prefer to leave the war behind rather than relive it through storytelling. The bent nail sight, the modification that had allowed him to reach targets beyond the accepted limits of doctrine, was never mentioned in interviews or memoirs because no one thought to ask about it. Military historians studying sniper operations in World War II focus on official programs and documented innovations, missing the improvised field modifications that existed outside formal channels. It was not until the late 1980s, more than 40 years after the events described here, that the story of Raymond Dalton's bent nail sight began to emerge from obscurity. The discovery came through an unlikely source, a military memorabilia collector who purchased a Springfield M1903A4 rifle at an estate sale in Pennsylvania. The rifle had belonged to a World War II veteran, and it bore an unusual feature, a small bent piece of metal soldered to the rear sight assembly. Intrigued, the collector began researching the modification, eventually tracing the rifle's history and identifying its original user. Further investigation revealed that similar modifications had appeared on other rifles used by snipers in the 20th Infantry Division during the final months of the European campaign. Interviews with surviving veterans confirmed that improvised range markers had been used, though the practice had never been officially documented. The story that emerged was one of innovation born from necessity, of soldiers solving tactical problems through ingenuity when official doctrine proved inadequate. Raymond Dalton died in 1992, before the full significance of his improvised sight became widely known. He never received formal recognition for the modification that had enhanced American sniper effectiveness and saved lives. His obituary in the Bethlehem newspaper made brief mention of his military service, but provided no details. The bent nail sight that he created from scrap metal in a Belgian barn that had allowed him to kill 4 German observers at 510 yards on a cold November morning in 1944 remained unknown to all but a handful of military historians and collectors. Yet the broader lesson of Dalton's story, the insight it provides into how soldiers innovate under the pressure of combat, has slowly gained recognition. Modern military training increasingly acknowledges that published specifications often represent conservative estimates rather than absolute limits, that equipment can frequently perform beyond its rated capabilities when used by skilled operators who understand its potential. The rigid doctrinal thinking that once insisted 400 yards was the maximum effective range for rifle fire has given way to a more flexible approach that encourages experimentation and adaptation. In this sense, though Raymond, Dalton never received official credit. His bent nail sight contributed to a gradual evolution in military thinking about the relationship between doctrine and capability. The improvised modification that Army officers pretended not to notice, that was never formally tested or adopted, that existed in the gray zone between authorized and forbidden, demonstrated a truth that would eventually reshape how the military approached marksmanship training. Rifles could do more than the manuals claimed. Soldiers could achieve more than the doctrine expected. Innovation could come from the bottom up, from enlisted men working with hand tools and scrap materials, not just from research laboratories and official testing programs. The 4 German observers who died on that November morning in 1944, killed by shots that should have been impossible according to doctrine, were the immediate evidence of this truth. But the longer-term impact, measured in artillery barges that never fell, in American lives saved by the suppression of German forward observers, in the gradual spread of improvised sighting techniques among combat snipers, was far greater. Raymond Dalton's bent nail, his unauthorized modification, his quiet act of defiance against inadequate doctrine, changed the battlefield in ways that were never officially recorded but were nonetheless real. He was a steel worker who understood that tools could be improved, that published limits were often artificial, that precision and improvisation were not opposites but partners. He carried that understanding into combat and used it to solve a tactical problem that was killing his fellow soldiers. The Army never thanked him, never acknowledged what he had done, never adopted his innovation through official channels. But his bent nail sight worked, and that was enough. In the brutal mathematics of infantry combat, where effectiveness is measured in lives saved and enemies killed, Raymond Dalton's improvised modification proved his worth every time he squeezed the trigger and reached across 500 yards to eliminate a threat that doctrine said was untouchable. He asked for no recognition, kept no record, filed no report. He simply saw a problem, engineered a solution, and went back to the work of surviving the war. When it was over, he put away his rifle and returned to the steel mill, carrying with him the knowledge that he had made a difference, even if no one would ever officially acknowledge it. The bent nail remained on his rifle for the rest of the war, a tiny modification that represented a significant challenge to established thinking. After returning home, he stored the rifle in a closet and never spoke of it again. Years later, when he finally passed away, the rifle was sold along with his other possessions, its significance unknown to anyone involved in the transaction. It would take decades for researchers to piece together what that small bent piece of metal represented, to understand that they were looking at evidence of battlefield innovation that had been deliberately ignored by official channels. Today, the rifle resides in a private collection, displayed as an artifact of improvised military engineering. The bent nail is still attached, still positioned exactly where Dalton soldered it more than 70 years ago. Visitors who see it often struggle to understand how something so crude, so simple, could have made a significant difference in combat. But that misunderstanding reflects a failure to appreciate the context, to recognize that in 1944, in the mud and blood of the Hurtgen Forest, a piece of bent metal positioned with mathematical precision represented the difference between a wasted shot and a dead enemy, between American soldiers pinned by artillery and American soldiers advancing under covering fire from snipers who could reach targets previously considered safe.